Let's take a look at working with classes, styles, and attributes. Of course, we can do all the normal things that we do in HTML5 regarding classes. We can take any element and set the class attribute to whatever CSS classes we want. And for styles, generally we work with CSS rules. And with attributes, those are easy to set. You just add those to a DOM element and you're off. But with Angular, these become more dynamic. We want to be able to set these on the fly. And as the state of our applications change, we also might want to change the classes, styles, and attribute settings. So let's take a look at some special features of Angular that let us work with these items. So here we have an H3 tag, and we're using interpolation to get the job title. If we look at the TypeScript class, job title is set to CEO. But you'll also notice we have another property called title class. And this is referring to a CSS class that is being set either globally or within our style URLs. But the class is called red-text, and that simply makes the text red. How do we bind a class to our H3 tag? We can use square brackets with the special binding symbol class. And we can set that to, in this case, title class. And because we're binding, the Angular compiler kicks in, and we'll get access to our red text class. Let's see what this looks like. So here's our H3 tag, and we're binding to class in square brackets. We're setting it to title class, which is red text. What shows in the browser? We get our org chart element, and it's showing CEO in red. So our red text class was applied. So that lets us work with one class, but what if we wanted to work with multiple classes? How can we bind multiple classes at once? Well, instead of using the class binding, there's a special directive built into Angular called ngClass, and we can bind to that. And let's see what that looks like. So here in our H3 tag, we're binding to ngClass, the special directive, and we're setting it to title classes. Looking in our TypeScript class, we're setting title classes to an object literal. Red text is being set to false, and purple text is initialized to true. So each property in this object refers to a CSS class, and we set the values to true or false depending upon whether or not we want this class to apply. What shows in the browser? We get our component, and the CEO text is purple. And that comes from purple text being initialized to true. And the great thing about this ngClass binding is that we can dynamically change this object and change our styling as our application state changes. And here's another type of class binding that's really useful. Not only can we bind to the special class property, but we can bind to class.className. In this case, the class name is red-text. What shows in the browser? We get our component, and CEO is the color red. This comes from our TypeScript class where we're setting isRed equal to true. So I'm back to a simple H3 tag showing the job title, but we want to start looking at not just CSS classes, but individual styles, like individual CSS properties. You'll notice down below that I added title color equals red, but we're not using that yet. How can we bind a CSS style to our H3 tag? We can specify style.color. So style is the special value that we bind to, and we access the CSS property after that. So style.color or style.any CSS property. And because we're binding, the Angular compiler kicks in and we specify an expression. In this case, title color. So looking at our H3 tag now, we're setting style.color, we're binding to it, and we're setting it to text color. What shows in the browser? Our component shows CEO in red. So by using style, we can bind to any CSS property. One issue we have with some properties is that they have units attached to them. Here we're binding to style.font-size, but sizes can be represented in lots of different ways. You can use pixels, you can use percentages, you can use ems. So in this case, we can specify font-size.px for pixels. What shows in the browser? We get CEO, and it's 30 pixels high. We get the 30 from our TypeScript class. So now here we're binding to style.font-size.%symbol. What shows in the browser? Now we get a very tiny CEO. You can barely make it out. So the unit here is actually a percentage of the default font size. And because font size is set to 30, it's only 30% of the default font size's height. The point I'm trying to make is that you really need to be careful with your units on some of these CSS properties. Things can go wrong if you're working with the wrong unit. But we can specify the unit right here in our binding. Here we're going to bind to style.font-size, and we're not specifying a unit. What shows in the browser? Well, we get the extra large CEO. Even though we're not specifying the unit in our binding, the variable font size does specify a unit, 2 ems, which means 2 times the size of an M character. So the font is shown twice as big. In this example, let's look at the H3 tag again, and we're binding to ng-style. We've already seen how we can bind to ng-class, and ng-style is just another built-in Angular directive, which lets us work with more than one style at a time. And this is very common. You usually want to work with more than just one CSS property. So in this case, we're setting font styles to an object literal. We're setting the property color to green, and we're setting the property font-size.px to 30. What shows in the browser? We get a big green CEO. So the great thing about ng-style is that as our application state changes, we can dynamically update any CSS property we want. The last thing I want to look at is binding to attributes. In this example, I'm using a data-attribute, data-title, setting it to CEO. And this could have come from some legacy code or maybe some third-party component that uses data-attributes. But the key thing is that we want to bind to this attribute, data-title. But if we put data-title in square brackets, that would try to find a property called data-title. So how do we bind the job title property to an attribute, specifically this data-title attribute? There's a special binding called attr for attribute. We specify attr.data-title, or whatever attribute we want to work with. This way we get direct access to the attribute. And because it's in square brackets, Angular will evaluate job title. It'll look up its property in the class. So there's nothing visual about this, so I won't show that, but I'll just show what it looks like. We're binding to attr.data-title. And we could bind to any attribute this way. Some common attributes you might want to bind to are the accessibility attributes, the ARIA attributes. And there's also another popular one that gets used a lot called colspan if you work with tables. Colspan doesn't have a property, so you need to bind it this way as an attribute. So now you should be able to use Angular binding for classes, styles, and attributes. In the next video, we'll take out a few more special things we need to know for working with styling.